Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to make a start on the Axial SCX10 III. As usual, we'll start with some extra details and after the first couple of steps pick up the pace. Generally the instructions are rather excellent, but they're not perfect. Sometimes there's little bits of info missing that if you haven't put a kit together before will trip you up. And even if you have, there's still some bits that are going to make you think. Right, so the first couple of pages have lots of boring text in several languages, so we'll skip them and go straight to the tools. At a minimum, you're going to need a set of hex drivers. Now I found while building, the screws are of very good quality, but the smaller ones did tend to have their hexes ever so slightly oversized, so my cheaper 1.5mm drivers did tend to slip. As long as you've got a nice set though, you're going to be okay. Some of the screws are very stiff to do up, so I would recommend investing in a decent set. You will also need some nut drivers. You do get a standard cross wrench in the kit, but a couple with handles are always nice to have. Some pliers are handy too, there's a few E-clips to deal with. Once or twice some tweezers do come in quite handy. Otherwise that's about it. A sharp knife and a pair of scissors are going to be quite handy when masking up the body and adding the stickers though. On the next page of the manual we have this long list of icons and their meaning. It's worth keeping a mental note of these. There's icons for things like ensure free rotation, screw partially, and many others. For the most part though, if you're handy with kits, it's all common sense. Right, let's get started. We start with the axles, section A, which of course needs bag A. Each section is divided into steps, A1, A2 and so on. We'll go through the manual doing each step and each section. In the bag we get lots of plastic parts, the axle housings and the portal hubs and covers. We get a tube of thread lock gel and a tube of black grease. Now I'm going to guess it's molybdenum grease. Usually a lithium grease with small particles of molybdenum, that's hard to say, suspended in it. In the next bag we've got all the small bags. Now they are labelled A1, 2, 3 and 4, but these don't have anything to do with the steps in the manual, which might be a bit confusing. Rather, it's just letting you know that these are different types of parts. To make life easier, we're going to dump the contents of each of the bags into their own little pudding pots. It's a lot easier, especially with the screws and small parts, to find the ones we want as we build. Down the left hand side of the manual pages, we have the small parts required for the step. In this case, we need two 7x14 by 3.5mm bearings and 6 M2x8 screws. Also in the main diagram we can see we need the ring gear and the spool. These are metal parts, so as the manual says we're going to need some of the thread lock for the screws. Now it comes in a sealed tube with a pop-off lid. To open it we need to use a sharp knife to cut the end off the nozzle. We want to cut the minimum off so we have a small hole so it's easier to control how much thread lock comes out. To assemble we need to put some thread lock in the threaded holes in the spool, putting a spot into each one. Then using a cocktail stick stir it around a bit, then a paper towel to wipe off the excess. Now this is probably a little bit overkill for what we're doing, but we want the ring gear to sit perfectly flat on the spool, so we don't want a layer of thread lock ruining the fit. Now we can offer up the ring gear and start installing all the screws. For best results, start by installing the screws so they're still nice and loose, a bit short of bottoming out. Then, once they're all in, start going from side to side, just taking out the slack. Then as a third step, nip them up, again going side to side in the classic cross pattern. If you want to know more, look up how to torque down an engine head. It's exactly the same principle. And again, it's probably a bit overkill, but it's going to give us the best chance of making a straight part without building in any odd stresses. That just leaves the bearings, which simply pop on each side of the assembly. There's nothing to hold them on at the moment though, so be careful they don't roll away. Step A2, the pinion and cover. This time we need a 5x14x5 bearing, a 5x11x4 bearing and 4 M2.5x18 screws. And of course there's the axle and the cover. This time, rather than the thread lock, we need the tube of grease. Just like the thread lock, we'll need to cut the tip off so we can get the grease out. And lastly, we're going to need the pinion. To get the axle ready, we need to remove the cover. Now it's just a press fit, so all we need to do is pull at it and wiggle it to free it up. Just don't be tempted to pry it out with a tool, you're just going to damage the edges. Following the manual, all we need to do is pop the big bearing over the pinion shaft and press it into the axle, which is all well and good, but I found with other kits it's a good idea to pack the gap between the two bearings with grease to help keep water out. All we need to do is run some grease around the shaft over the large bearing before popping it in. Then, when we fit the smaller bearing from the outside, we've sandwiched the grease in between. It's not foolproof, of course, but I found it increases the life between servicing by quite a bit. Next, the ring gear assembly can drop in. Now, it only goes in one way, so there's no worries there. Just make sure the bearings are nicely seated all the way down. Right now, if you try spinning the gears, they're going to feel rough as anything, so we need to grease them up. Now there's two schools of thought here. First, we only need a little bit of grease, just to film over the teeth. The problem here is it's quite easy to be a bit too mean with it and run with some dry spots. Second is what I tend to do, and use plenty of grease, running a bead all the way around the ring gear. The trick is, once we're running the truck and running at full speed, the excess will be flung off, leaving just what's needed. There is of course a third method, where you completely pack the axle with grease, squeezing out all the air. The idea being to make it completely waterproof, but in my experience it just adds lots of dead weight and a huge amounts of drag on the drivetrain. Before we fit the cover, I'm going to run around the edge with some silicone grease. Now I've been doing this for a while on my TRX4 and it does seem to help keep the water out. Even after completely submerging the truck, the axles are still in good shape. We just need to run some around the edge where it fits in the axle. Then when we press the cover into the axle, it'll fill all the little gaps, making it fairly watertight. We'll just need to wipe the excess away so we don't make a mess. Now from the other side we install the 4 screws, and just like the ring gear we want to install them nice and evenly. And we tighten them up a little bit at a time in a cross pattern so the cover is pulled in as straight down as we can. Once it's tightened up, we should find the pinion shaft will rotate fairly smoothly. It might be very slightly grabby, but in general it should feel smooth. It'll take a minute or two of running the truck to get everything seated just right, so don't worry too much if it's not 100%. Step A3, the front portals. This time we'll need 2 of the big 10 by 15 by 4 bearings, 2 5 by 13 by 4 bearings, 4 5 by 11 by 4 bearings, 8 M2.5 by 10s, and 2 2.5 by 12 pins. For gears we need 2 of the small gears and 2 of the big gears, 1 set per portal. There's the stub axles, which are easy to spot because they have an M4 thread at one end for the wheel nuts. For plastics we need the 2 portals. There's a left side and a right, not that it matters much at this point as the internals are the same. And we need 2 portal covers. But watch out with these as the front ones and rear ones are slightly different. For the front axle we need the ones with a number 1 moulded right down at the bottom. The number 2s fit the rear. In the portal we need to install one of the big bearings in the top from the inside. It's a tight fit and really doesn't want to go down straight. I found using the wrong end of a small screwdriver helped quite a lot. Once the bearing's part way down you can get it the rest of the way with a finger fairly easily. In the small hole we pop in a 5 by 11 by 4 which just slots straight in, and in the cover we fit another 5 by 11 by 4 in the small hole and a 5 by 13 by 4 in the big hole. To make up the stub axle we need to fit the pin and large gear. Now I tend to add a little bit of grease in the slots in the gear before assembly. It'll reduce any rattles a little bit, and as things wear it's going to prevent any rust building up. We just need a couple of small blobs. Now we slide it over the non-threaded end of the stub axle, pop the pin in the hole so it's halfway in, and slide the gear back up the shaft so the pin sits in the slot. For a bit more life extending grease, we'll add a bead around the side of the gear before fitting the shaft into the bearing. I found on the TRX4 it just helps keep the water out of the bearings if it does manage to get into the portals. We will of course need some grease on the teeth too. A nice bead while turning the gear will do the trick. Now we can drop the small gear in, and for the moment it doesn't have a shaft, so it's just going to float around in there. We'll add some more grease on this face of the large gear and a bit on the small gear before offering up the portal cover. With a bit of a wiggle it should pop in, leaving no gaps. You could also run some silicone grease around the edge just like on the axle. Being careful with the build at this stage can really help keep the internals fresh for that bit longer. Last step then, we need to screw in the 4 screws and nip them up. Once complete, we've got a working portal. For the time being, because the small gear is just floating, we can't really get a feel for how smooth it's going to be. We'll have to fit it to the axle with the main axle shafts first. And because the other portal is exactly the same as this one, we'll skip the repeat and just cut to it being finished. Step A4, fitting the portals to the axle. Now we don't need much for this one, just 2 5x11x4 bearings, 4 kingpins, the 2 axle shafts with the universal joints, and all the assemblies that we've put together so far. In the end of the axles we pop in one of the bearings. Now it's just a press fit, but you might want a bit of grease just to help keep the water out. For the axle shafts we're going to start with the portal end. Now in the portal we're going to smear some grease around the inside of the hole, getting some in the square hole in the gear and around the edge of the bearing before offering up the square drive on the shaft. And just for good measure we'll add some more grease on the end of the shaft too. Now it's going to need a fair bit of wiggling to get everything lined up. The trick is not to force it. Just use some gentle pressure while wiggling the end around to get it lined up. Next we're going to add some more grease to the other end of the shaft so it slides nicely into the spool. And we'll add some around the bearing to block the water. Now it's not a perfect solution, but in general it will extend the life of the parts between rebuilds. But of course, if you're somewhere dry and you avoid water, it really doesn't matter either way. Insert the shaft, giving it a spin and a wiggle so it lines up with the spool, and set up the portal so its holes are lined up with the holes in the C-hub. Then to attach it, we use the 2 kingpin shoulder screws. Now I found the spacing wasn't quite perfect, so when I did them up snug, they were very stiff. I had to loosen them around half a turn so the portals were free to steer. They were still a little bit stiff though, but I do get the feeling they're going to free up nicely after a couple of runs when the truck's complete. Now it can be tempting to run a drill through the holes to add a bit of clearance, but you then run the risk of overdoing it and making the steering sloppy. The other portal fits in the same way, just with the other shaft. Install it, and we've got the front axle ready to fit to the chassis. Now the rest of the A steps are almost the same as the bits we've already done. The only difference is the lack of steering. So let's have a quick run through. A5 is making up the ring gear and spool, so the same as A1. A6 is installing the ring and pinion to the axle, so that's the same as A2, which just leaves A7, the portal gears. Now it's almost exactly the same as the front, but we build it with the axle shafts and the portals in one go. Since it's mostly the same, I'll just point out a little gotcha that caught me out for not paying attention. Trying to build when I should have long since gone to bed is always a problem. I know I shouldn't do it, but here we are again. The end of the axle, where the axle pops into the portal, has a nice slot for a bearing. So with a quick look at the diagram, I popped a bearing on the end of the shaft before fitting it. And well, it all fitted rather well, so I didn't think anything of it. Later on, we can see the small gear in the portal is well above the big gear. A good indication of what's about to happen, but my tired brain didn't notice, so I went ahead and greased everything up. It was only when I offered up the cover and couldn't get it to meet with the axle, I thought something was amiss. After looking properly at the diagram and having a good face palm and some minor swearing, I found the problem and rebuilt without that bearing, and not surprisingly it all went together perfectly. It's a good example of why we should never force any parts together. If something doesn't fit, figure out why. Don't just force things. Find the problem first. With both sides correctly built, we have the two axles ready to go. But we won't be back to them for a while. We've got the dampers and gearbox to build up next. The dampers being a rather short step, so we might have to have a double video next week. In the meantime though, that's going to be about it. As always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!